Hi, welcome to Tradition Today. I'm Father David Smith, the pastor of St. George's Orthodox Church in Utica, New York. And today we come to the third installment of our series on the 7 ecumenical councils. Last week we were talking about the great heretic Arius, and just getting started on learning a little bit about his rise to power and the influence that he held over the church. And we'll continue with that today. But I pray that as we examine the early history of our faith, that we would be informed and encouraged to see how the early church gave us certain attitudes and traditions which lead us to God. Now, Arius. Arius became known in the days when he was a monastic in Egypt for his very strict asceticism and his hatred of people who refused to go through persecutions to the death. When he was ordained a priest in 311 in Alexandria, he was already an old man and had been living in monasticism for a long time. Unfortunately, he had also developed a particular theory about the person of Jesus Christ. And that theory can be summed up really in just a few words. He believed that Jesus was a creation of God, that Jesus Christ had been created by God like you, like me, like the trees, like the clouds, like the water, like the little dogs that run around in the street. Jesus had been was a creation of God. That was the essential teaching of Arianism. And in essence, Arius sought to preserve the notion that Jesus was the Son of God from birth. He was smart enough to know that Jesus didn't become the Son of God at his baptism the way some of the earlier heretics had believed. But he also wanted to preserve the idea that God stood alone as a deity. In other words, Arius thought, well, you've got God up there. He's a transcendent being, creator and sustainer of the world. And you've got Jesus Christ walking around in Palestine taught. How can God be in two places at once? That was an essential part of the mystery of the Trinity, isn't it? And that's what Arius had a problem with. He couldn't imagine how it is that God could be there and God could be incarnate in Jesus Christ. It seemed that Arius wanted to make the difference between the earthly and the heavenly very clear. God's essence could not be captured completely in human form. It needed to be mediated through something he had created. So Arius was very close to being accurate in terms of saying that Jesus, he believed that his spirit was divine and his soul was divine and things like that, but he just couldn't accept the fact that God was dwelling in a human body. This clearly flew in the face of Christian teaching and biblical revelation, and Arius was excommunicated in 321. That should have been the end of it, right? It should be that when the church says something, that everybody says, okay, this is what Christians believe. But, of course, it was not. Arius started to gather people around him who believed as he did, and gained the approval of several bishops outside Alexandria, and he wrote innumerable letters. That's one reason that we know so much about Arius, is because he didn't skimp on writing letters and using the post system. Well, I don't know if they had a post office, but anyway, he wrote a lot of letters. He was by then, incidentally, bishop in Alexandria, and as a bishop wielded a great deal of influence over people and also influenced other bishops. Arius's persistence made it so that Constantine the Great, when he slowly began to embrace Christianity and to see it as the religion of his empire, found that he had a seriously divided church on his hands. The Arian controversy, as I mentioned last week, it occupied the minds and the fists of everybody in the empire, from the lowliest vegetable seller in Egypt right up to the Emperor Constantine himself. This was an issue that really occupied the minds of virtually everybody in the empire, and very often would result in some very serious street brawls and riots and dissension in the empire that made Constantine very nervous, because he needed a united empire. Constantine wrote to Bishop Alexander, who was the bishop who excommunicated Arius, and to Arius himself, and told them to reconcile. Constantine was no theologian, and he couldn't understand why the two church leaders couldn't simply come to some halfway point for the sake of harmony. Now remember, I talked about that in our first segment when I talked about the First Ecumenical Council in the book of Acts. The idea is not to say some people believe this and some people believe this, so let's come to a middle ground. It has never been that way in Christianity. It's some people believe this, some people believe this, but we're going to try to find what the will of God is. Constantine didn't understand that. He was a politician, he was a soldier, so he wanted to have a treaty, right? He wanted to get the two bishops together, and you're going to come up with a treaty and figure out a good halfway point so we can get some peace and harmony in the empire. But remember the council in Jerusalem? The leaders of the two separate sides in this debate weren't interested in coming to some mutually agreeable, friendly terms. They were interested only in standing up for what they believed to be God's will in this matter. One letter that the emperor wrote to these two expressed his extreme frustration over the issue. It said, "Give me back my quiet days and carefree nights. Do not let me spend my days joylessly." This is the emperor of Byzantium. This is the most powerful. Well, let me read on. Isn't it interesting that the most powerful person in the world would express his dependence on his newfound faith so genuinely and so imploringly? As a matter of fact, Constantine could snap his fingers and have both of their heads cut off. No one would have anything to say about it. I wonder if this came from the fact that Constantine was introduced to Christianity by his mother. If you know your Roman history, you know how Constantine's father divorced his mother in order to marry into the royal family and left Helena to live in obscurity. In other words, what happened was Constantine's father was introduced to Constantine's mother when he was essentially, we would say, staying in a hotel. And she was working in the hotel. It was her uncle's hotel, and she was essentially working there. And they met, and they were married. And Constantine was the result of that marriage, right? But then later on, Constantine's father, who was a member of the Roman military, he saw that he could progress up the ladder in terms of his career if he were married to the right person. And certainly Helena, who is Constantine's mother, she was not the right person. She was from the lower classes. So what he did is he divorced her, and really almost with her consent. Almost with her consent, because she understood that if her husband ascended, so would her son. And she wanted the best future for her son. So they divorced. She went and lived in obscurity in a muddy little town, and Constantine's father ascended, married into the royal family and ascended up the throne, and eventually became one of the Caesars of the empire, who are sort of the people who were underneath the emperor in ruling. While her son was away from her, literally conquering the world, she came to embrace Christianity. And when she moved into the imperial palace in Constantinople, after he had been proclaimed emperor, she brought her faith with her. As a matter of fact, I didn't write this here, but she brought a bishop with her, Bishop Hosius from Spain. He was the one who influenced her the most, and also Constantine's sister. He had brought them to Christianity, had taught them about faith in Jesus Christ, and they were embracing Christianity through this bishop's teaching. When they moved to the palace in Constantinople, Bishop Hosius did as well, and he became, in essence, the spiritual father for the entire family, for the entire royal family living in Jerusalem. Again, another odd thing about Constantine, before I go on about this odd thing about Constantine, it strikes me that this is an illustration of that old saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. If you think about Helena's background, she was an very obscure worker in a hotel in Britain, and all of a sudden, and without any military victories, without ascending to the throne, without writing letters, gathering followers, without doing anything like that, but simply by embracing Christianity and then talking to her son about Christianity, she influenced the history of the world very clearly and very definitely influenced the whole history of the world. Again, another odd thing about Constantine. He was not a particularly religious man, but his mother, a woman of apparently no noble or powerful birth whatsoever, was able to influence the course of history in ways that we cannot even imagine, because she influenced him to become a Christian. Anyway, back to the problems of the church. Constantine was not a patient man when it came to having people follow his advice. He was like most Roman emperors or Byzantine emperors. Incidentally, Byzantine and Roman were, in the minds of the Byzantines, essentially the same thing. So it wasn't until much later in Byzantine history that Byzantines called themselves Byzantines. In especially the early days of the empire, and even during the ecumenical councils, they really saw themselves as a continuation of Rome. So I use those terms kind of interchangeably. He waited for only a short time before deciding to intervene in the Arian controversy, and he did so by calling the First Ecumenical Council to Nicaea in 325. Constantine went to his most trusted advisors and said, "What am I going to do with these Christians? They're good people, but they're fighting about something, and I can't understand what they're fighting about." The advice was, get them all together. Bring all of the bishops of the world together in the city of Nicaea and get them to talk this thing out and decide what's right and what's wrong. Constantine had embraced Christianity only to some degree since his victory over Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge near Rome, when he received assurance in a vision that Christ would give him victory. This is the origin of the Chi Rho symbol. It looks like a P with an X through it. You still see that symbol occasionally. And what it meant was, in this sign you shall conquer. And this was a vision that he had while he was awaiting to, essentially, he was in being challenged to be emperor from another person who wanted to be emperor Maxentius. And while they were waiting to begin the battle, Constantine had this vision. He had that symbol etched into the shields of his army, and he won a decisive victory that way. Maxentius actually drowned in a river near Rome. However, Constantine did not fully understand Christianity, and it had not yet been baptized. He wasn't baptized until he almost died. He was very close to death when he was baptized. And that happened a lot in the early church because people believed that they wanted to be baptized and then after that sin no more. Well, you don't want to be baptized when you were 17 then. They would wait until they were quite a bit older. Consequently, we see that the First Ecumenical Council, one of the most critical events in the history of the church, was presided over by a non-Christian. And indeed, Constantine presided over the council. He did not convene it and then withdraw to let the participants have their debate. When the bishops argued too much, he silenced them. When they wrote the creed, he suggested some of the wording and so on. And when the council decided that Arius was indeed wrong and excommunicated the bishops who would not abandon their Arian views, Constantine used the full powers of the state to suppress the spread of the heresy, at least for a time. Whoever happened to have Constantine's ear at any particular moment also seemed to have his support. Constantine decided to use the Christians to suppress the Christians, but he couldn't distinguish who were the bad guys and who were the goods. Who were the good? He liked Arius, as a matter of fact. When he met Arius, he was very impressed with him. And he did not like Saint Athanasius, who was the greatest defender of orthodoxy at the council. He did appoint Athanasius to be the bishop of Alexandria, but then he threw him into exile in 336, because Athanasius basically did what Athanasius thought was right. And so sometimes he was on the side of Constantine, sometimes he wasn't. And when Arius would come, or some of Arius's friends would grab the ear of the emperor and get him to sort of change his ways a little bit, Athanasius would let him have it. And Constantine didn't always like that. In fact, no Byzantine emperor really liked that. Since Constantine's theology waved around like a leaf in the wind, it's very hard to keep track of his political interventions in church affairs. But before I go on, I want to tell you a wonderful story about the First Ecumenical Council. St. Athanasius came into the council at a time when the Arians were getting the upper hand in the debate. And I want to make this clear, that when Arius was spreading his heresy, he really had a significant part of the church on his side, way more than half. Athanasius wanted to impress upon his hearers that Christ could indeed have two natures, one human and the other divine. He held up a piece of broken pottery and shouted, "Why cannot you understand that this is made from fire and water?" As he said this, he squeezed it, and water came out the bottom, and fire shot out from the top. Do you think that's just a legend? I don't know. You can believe it's just a legend if you want to. I think it's a miracle. Incidentally, speaking of stories from the First Ecumenical Council, and there are many stories from this council, St. Nicholas, the saint who has unfortunately come to be associated with red suits, obesity, and malls, was present at that council. He was the bishop of Myra in Lycia. He didn't speak at all, probably because he was not a trained theologian. However, he did become so enraged at one point at Arius's arrogance that he ran over in the council meeting and hit Arius in the face with his fist. Does that sound like Santa Claus? Well, it was St. Nicholas, though. Constantine banished him from the council and pressured the bishops to take away his bishopric. They were going to humiliate St. Nicholas. However, on one particular night, a number of the bishops and Constantine had identical dreams in which some of the apostles told them to reinstate Nicholas, and they did. A far cry from the jolly man upon whose lap my children sit in order to demand expensive toys. I still have some time, so I'll go on a little bit. But now the cat had been let out of the bag, so to speak, and emperors from the time of Constantine onwards saw themselves as protectors of Christianity and amateur theologians. This did not present a really great problem until the iconoclastic controversy of the 7th century, which went right through almost to the 9th, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, we're done with the First Ecumenical Council. This is a very important part of Christianity. I've talked about how Arius was condemned at the council, and that was really why the council was called. But any time we hear about these councils, there are also many, many, many other canons that come from them. Other things are considered about the behavior of priests, about how to gather and disseminate money that the church collects, and so on and so forth. There are many, many, many canons associated with these councils. And in them we see that the church fathers really desire in all things to find what is the will of God. What does God want us to do? How does He want us to run His church? And that was indeed the case that you saw at the First Ecumenical Council, that it was their desire. Constantine wanted peace in the empire. But the saints who were there in the council, like St. Athanasius, St. Nicholas, St. Spiridon of Termethus, these famous saints of the church, they really wanted to see what God wanted for the church. Now, lest you think that I'm saying the ecumenical councils are important just because I happen to be an Orthodox priest, I want to give you this quote from another saint who was a contemporary with the First Ecumenical Council, and his name was St. Gregory of Nyssa. He's talking about the sort of character of the empire at this time. If you ask for change, someone philosophizes to you on the begotten and the unbegotten. If you ask the price of bread, you are told the Father is greater and the Son inferior. If you ask, is the bath ready? Someone answers, the Son was created from nothing. In other words, in all of the urban parts of the empire, people were swept up with the discussion that occupied the fathers at the council. When the council produced what we know today as the Nicene Creed, many churches in the empire quickly made it a part of the liturgy. Hopefully, they thought it was complete and clear enough that no more heresies would bother the church. This is why today, if you go to an Orthodox church during the course of the liturgy, everyone in the church is going to say the creed. That comes from this particular time when people in the church were so concerned about heresy and about the influence that it was having over the church that they decided that they wanted to have the creed said as a spiritual exercise, as a way of guiding and guarding the church. Not only were they wrong, but the Arian heresy continued to plague the bishops and the emperor from that time onward, even after the death of Arius. Arius had recanted, by the way, and he was on the way, and this is incidentally very late in his life. Arius finally decided that his teaching was heretical, that he was wrong, that all of this work that he had done and so on, it was said that when he traveled, he would have choirs following him singing, and all these people would he had like a retinue, a huge group of people following him, and he influenced Christianity in many different ways. He finally decided toward the end of his life that he was wrong, that the council was right, and that he was going to recant. He was on his way to celebrate a liturgy at the cathedral in Alexandria as his way of being accepted back into the church, which would be his welcome back into the church. On this way to the liturgy, he stopped in a public restroom. He went in, he sat down, and he died. He never was reconciled to the church. Some histories say that he slumped over so much that he fell in, but that may be a sort of posthumous heretic's punishment, I think. So some people say that it was almost like what we would consider to be an outhouse. And these things were in Alexandria. If you, sort of needed to use the facilities and you were out in public, you could go to these sort of public outhouse things. And he was on his way to the liturgy, and he went into one of these things. And some of the historians believe the story that he slumped over so much that he actually fell down through the hole, and that's the way a heretic dies. So when we come to the Second Ecumenical Council in 381, the bishops essentially needed to debate the same things and reaffirm them, because the First Ecumenical Council should have been the end of it. It should have been that the bishops said, this is the way the church is going. Arius and his friends would have said, okay, that's the decision, we're going to stick with that. But as is often the case, humility is a sort of a virtue that is easily escapes some people. And when the Second Ecumenical Council was called, they had to debate the same things that the First Ecumenical Council did. However, The political scene had changed significantly, and the decrees of the Emperor Theodosius declared that Christianity was not only allowed, but was to be the only religion of the Roman Empire. The Nicene Creed we have today, incidentally, is from the Second Council, technically speaking. The First Council created a Nicene Creed. That's why we call it the Nicene Creed. It was in the city of Nicaea. But it was the Second Council that really sort of tuned up the wording. They changed it a little from the First Council in order to clearly state that Christ was not a creature, but one in essence with the Father, and Arianism had been defeated. Well, I see that we've run out of time. We're looking at the Second Ecumenical Council, and maybe next week we'll look a little bit at that and then continue on. And now, may the God of the ages, who has guided his church through 2,000 years and continues to call people to himself through it, bless you and keep you until we come together again for another segment of Tradition Today.